Access to the outside world is facilitated by navigable waterways, and access to these waterways is radically different in different parts of the world. Although Africa is more than twice the size of Europe, its coastline is shorter than the European coastline. That is because the coastline of Europe twists and turns innumerable times, creating harbors where ships can anchor, protected from the rough waters of the open sea, while the African coastline is much smoother and has far fewer harbors. The enormous importance of rivers or harbors to economic and cultural development is indicated by the fact that nearly all the world's greatest cities developed on rivers and harbors, at least during the millennia before railroads and automobiles lowered the cost of land transport. The fact that so many cities around the world arose on navigable waterways reflects in part vast differences in costs between transporting goods by water and transporting them by land. For example, in mid-19th century America, before the Transcontinental Railroad was built, San Francisco could be reached both faster and cheaper from a port in China than it could be reached over land from the banks of the Missouri. In the city of Typhills, it was cheaper to import kerosene from Texas across 8,000 miles of water than to get it over land from Baku, less than 400 miles away. Similarly, huge disparities between land transport and water transport costs have been common in Africa, in Japan, and in England before the railroad era. In the Ottoman Empire, the estimated cost of shipping wheat just 100 kilometers exceeded the value of the wheat itself. Even after the development of roads and of motorized transport, trains and planes, water transport has genuinely remained much cheaper than land transport. For example, transporting oil by ship costs about 1/4 of the cost of transporting it by pipeline, less than 1/5 of the cost of transporting it by railroad, and a little more than 1% of the cost of shipping it by truck. The vast amounts of food and other products needed continuously to supply a city's population, and the vast amount of raw materials and finished merchandise to be moved in and out of the city to earn the money to pay for that population's consumption have all been carried much more cheaply by water. It is therefore hardly surprising that many cities are on rivers. London on the Thames, Cairo on the Nile, Paris on the Sena, New York on the Hudson. Many other cities like Singapore, Sydney, and Stockholm are on harbors, and still others are huge lakes or inland seas, like Chicago, Odessa, or Sevastopol. Nor should it be surprising that Western Europe, heavily crisscrossed by rivers, is one of the most densely urbanized regions of the world, while tropical Africa, where navigable waterways are much more scarce, has long remained one of the least urbanized areas in the world. The relatively few cities that have arisen independently of waterways have usually had other transportation advantages. In the great desert regions, for example, the distance between sources of drinking water, compared to the distance that a camel can travel without water, determine which routes across the trackless sands or dry steeples are feasible, and which are not. In turn, these routes and their traffic determine which of the oases has enough economic activity passing through them to become permanent settlements. Settlements at the crossroads of several routes through the desert. Samarkand in Central Asia, for example, could grow to be large cities, much as rivers and harbor ports grew into urban centers. in other parts of the world. The development of railroads and later automobiles and trucks brought a revolution in land transport that made water transport unnecessary to create major cities, which could now be based on railroad junctions, Atlanta, or based on the automobile, Los Angeles. The railroad revolution was particularly important in sub-Saharan Africa, which was largely lacking in both waterways and draft animals, the latter being victims of disease borne by the test fly. Prior to the building of railroads by European colonial powers, Africans often carried freight on their heads. While this made for colorful caravanses of porters, it was also a very expensive form of transport. In British West Africa, for example, it took 37 men to carry a ton of coca for a day's journey. 1,000 times as much could be carried 10 times as far by train, using half a dozen men. Despite the importance of these modern developments, for most of history and most of the world, waterways have been crucial. During the European industrialization of the 19th century, every one of the early industrial regions had the benefit of navigable waterways. Where that advantage was lacking, as in parts of Eastern Europe and Mediterranean Europe, and especially in the Balkans, economic development lagged far behind that in such countries as Britain, France, and Germany. The standard of living in the less favored parts of Europe was much more like the standards of living in non-European countries than like those in the more advanced parts of the continent. The fossil fuels, which were largely lacking in southern Europe, for example, often could not be brought into the interior by water, the only economically feasible way of developing them. Although urban growth was dramatic in much of 19th century Europe, few towns developed in the Balkans, as roads and railroads developed and were improved in the more developed parts of Europe. They remained virtually unknown in the Balkans, so that people living in Balkan villages were isolated from people in other villages less than 20 miles away. The Balkan mountains fractured the peninsula culturally as well as isolating it economically, thereby contributing to the tribalistic divisions and lethal hatreds which have long marked the region. Although the Balkans were rich in natural harbors, there were very few rivers to connect these harbors, which were often cut off by mountains. Much of 19th century Europe not only grew economically, but became interconnected with other nations within the continent and overseas. Much of Eastern and Southeastern Europe lived close to self-sufficiently, which is to say it was isolated, poor, and backward. To have a large economic or cultural universe, it is not enough that there be waterways. How navigable those waterways are is crucial. Africa has the Nile and other great rivers, but these other rivers have serious impediments to navigation and have seldom produced either cities or civilizations comparable to those of Egypt. Because most of sub-Saharan Africa is more than 1,000 feet above sea level, its rivers must come down from that on their way to the sea. The resulting rapids, cascades, and waterfalls prevent even the greatest of sub-Saharan rivers from providing access to and from the sea, in the way that the Hudson, the Yangtze, the Dans, or other great commercial waterways of the world can. Although Africa's Zami River carries more water than any of these three other rivers just mentioned, its waterways alone are enough to preclude it from having the same significance as an artery of trade or as a site from cities. Even African rivers that are navigable may be navigable for some limited distances between cascades or waterfalls, or by boats of limited size, or for some limited times during the rainy seasons. However, the dry season often severely reduces or eliminates their navigability. There are no mountain ranges in sub-Saharan Africa to catch snow, whose melting would provide the water to sustain its waterways when there is no rain. as mountain snows do in other parts of the world. Nor is Africa's geographic situation any better as regards to harbors. Not only does the smooth African coastline provide few harbors, its coastal waterways are often too shallow for large ocean-going ships to approach closely to the land. The net result was that even during centuries when much of the international trade of the world went around Africa on its way between Europe and Asia, relatively seldom did these ships attempt to stop and trade with the Africans. They could ship in those relatively few places where there were harbors, or they could anchor offshore and have cargo loaded into smaller craft that were able to make their way to land through the shallow coastal waters. Still, the higher cost of taking much longer to unload a given amount of cargo means that there were severe constraints against international trade with even the coastal peoples of Africa, much less those in the vast interior hinterlands or at higher elevations. Moreover, the coastal plains of Africa, only 20 miles in width, often with steep compartments behind them. In short, with harbors as with rivers, Africa seldom had the geographic essentials for developing cities. Where cities or large-scale political units did develop in tropical Africa, it was typically where these geographic hindrances were not as great. Disparities between the cost of land transport and water transport translate into similar disparities in the reach of trade by nations and people with and without navigable waterways. Huge transportation costs shrink the economic universe, severely limiting how far goods can be carried and severely limiting which goods can have sufficient value condensed into a small size and weight to be feasible to transport over land for substantial distances. These same high transportation costs shrink the cultural universe as well as handicappen not only economic development, but more importantly, the development of the people themselves, who lack access to as wide a range of other people's knowledge, skills, and technologies, as do people who are situated in port cities and other cultural crossroads. The significance of particular geographic features, mountains, rivers, climate, soil, etc., is even greater when these features are viewed in combination. For example, the effect of rainfall on agriculture depends not only on how much rainfall there is, but also on the ability of the soil to hold it. Thus, a modest amount of rainfall may be sufficient for a flourishing agriculture of northern China, while rain falling on the limestone soils of the Balkans may drain off rapidly underground. Similarly, the economic value of navigable waterways depends on the lands adjacent to them. Navigable rivers, which go through land without the resources for either industry or agriculture. The Amazon, for example, are of little economic value, even though navigable waterways in general have been crucial to the economic and cultural development of other regions more fully endowed with other resources. Speaking of Amazon, it is by far the world's greatest river, but the soils in its region have been characterized as staringly poor, and has led to no great cities being established along its banks. In Russia as well, waterways isolated from the major natural resources of the country, as well as from each other, cannot match the economy role of rivers, which flow into one another and then into the sea, after passing through agriculturally or industrially productive regions as in Western Europe. The Volga is Russia's premier river for shipping, even though there are other Russian rivers which have more than twice as much water flow, because the Volga passes through areas containing most of the resources and people of the country. Larger rivers in Siberia, which drain northward into the Arctic Ocean when they are not frozen and cannot flow at all, have no economic significance of the Volga. Sometimes a variety of favorable geographic features exist in combination with a given region, as in northwestern Europe, and sometimes virtually all are lacking, as in much of tropical Africa, while still other parts of the world have some of these favorable features, but not others. The consequences include not only large variations in economic well-being, but more fundamentally, large variations in the skills and experience, the human capital of the people themselves. Given the enormous range of combinations of geographic features, the people from different regions of the earth have had highly disproportionate opportunities to develop particular skills and economic experience, or to acquire them from others. This often produces very different economic and social outcomes. Among the more geographic, fortunate parts of the world, in terms of having natural resources needed for the development of a modern industrial economy, as well as the navigable waterways to carry both these resources and the products resulting from them, have been Northern and Western Europe. Iron, ore, and coal deposits, the key ingredients of steel manufacturing, and the heavy industry dependent on it, are connected in the Ruhr Valley, in Wales, in Sweden, and the region so bitterly fought over by France and Germany. Western Europe with much prime agriculture, land, and navigable rivers. Europe in general has had many peninsulas, islands, and numerous harbors that give the continent excellent access to the sea.